Hello guys, and welcome to another episode here. Today we're going to learn how to deploy a three-tier application on the popular PaaS Railway. So a three-tier application is a front end, back end, and a database. Um, if you like me and you spend countless hours banging your head on AWS, this is now the time to switch over. Railway is built for solo developers and not for enterprise. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the application we're going to be testing and deploying, just so you guys get a sense. It's not that difficult. It's pretty simple. It's just a map visualization of federal transit data. So on the left-hand side, you have a map of metropolitan areas, and if you click on one, say Portland, you get a details pane on the right-hand side that shows information such as the population, trips per person, and breakdown of rail versus bus. Click on another. That's an example. Alrighty, here we have Railway. This is called the Project Canvas view, and we have it for particularly the staging environment. And what we can do is we can add services. Services are pretty much anything. They're front ends, they're back ends, they're databases, and you can connect them nice and visually here on the Canvas view. So let's get started and start with the front end. So you basically select a front end repository, and I'm going to select my front end repository. And when you click on it, a control panel will appear on the right hand side, and there's you have to deploy it. So what happens is that this is actually a container. It's going to be run as a container. But if you actually go look at my actual repository um, here, this does not have a Docker file. So how is it getting converted into a container, you might ask? Well, there's something, and I don't know the details of it very well, but there's something called Railpack. So here's Railpack, and Railpack will do its best guess on how to convert this into a container, and usually does a good job. Right now, I have static. My front end consists of static files, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to generate a domain, and we're going to deploy. This will take a few seconds to do. And then we'll see a domain. So let's see if this works just right out of the box and see if we can connect to this. So it doesn't work. So you might wonder why it doesn't work. And we have to explain this idea of ports. So here it's asking for a port. And this is going to be the port that the application listens on. So the first two things to understand is there's an internal port, which the application listens on, and then there's the public port, which is what you type in, which is going to be just default to 80. The load balancer is responsible for the public port, and the application server is responsible for listening on the internal port. And we're using HTTP server. There's others like Nginx, but that one specifically listens on port 8080. So we need to update the port to listen to 8080. So let's update it, and let's reload the page. Okay, now we get something that looks more plausible. The front end's loading, but you'll notice there's nothing loading in the map, and that's perfectly okay because the back end doesn't exist, and neither does the database. And in fact, we can take a look and see some of the API requests if you want to take a look in the network tab, and you'll see that these APIs are returning they are returning, what are they returning here? They're returning some sort of error. You can't. It's hard to tell what it is, but they're calling localhost 5000. That doesn't seem right, and we'll see why it's calling that. But we will change it as well. Okay, now that the front end is up, we're going to add the back end. So we do the similar thing. We right click, click GitHub repo, and this time it's going to be federal underscore transit. This is the backend repository. So let me go ahead and open up the repository in GitHub. So here it is. Now, in contrast to the front end, it does have a Docker file, And the reason that we do have a Docker file for my particular application is because there are database migration scripts and Word and Excel documents that we need in order for the database to get correctly seeded. And that would be hard to do unless we did not copy those files over. So that's kind of the main reason that we have it. Okay, so right now it's we're going to create a domain in the similar way that we did for the front end. And let's rename this to backend so it's a little clearer what it is. So we're going to generate a domain and we need to deploy. So this usually takes a little bit of time, maybe about a few minutes to go. So we'll just wait until that happens. So in the meantime, if we try out our database, you'll see that it's not found because it hasn't loaded yet. And let me explain something called logs. So there's two, AWS has a much more complicated log structure, but here they're just separated into three logs. The build logs, these are everything to build the up until building the Docker image. So we see here that the Docker image kind of executed fine. Then we see we have the deploy logs. This is what happens when the container actually runs and we see with the job application. So here we see some errors from the Spring boot load, and this is completely expected, and it's because we haven't set up the database. So we're going to do that next. Okay, so we right click and we go to database, and you'll see here there's a few options. Postgres is actually a better database than MySQL. It provides more complex features, but for our purposes, MySQL is just fine, and that's actually what is supported by the backend version. So we're going to create a MySQL database. So we'll put this here in the right hand side so it's easier to see. Let's see if we can rename this to MySQL. No, I don't think we can because it's already another name, something named that, but that's fine. Sometimes you'll see here that it takes a while to load, like you'll get this socket exception. It just means that it didn't work, and you just give it a few more tries and it should be okay. So we're just gonna let it sit here for a while. Okay, so it worked. So now what we're going to do is we're going to see if we can connect to the database. So I have here on my machine a MySQL workbench. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a connection. So let me delete this. So I'm going to create a connection for, I'm going to call it railway staging, and go back to see the API, what the API is. So this is the URL. So copy the URL. And copy over the port. Oops, not working. What's happening? Okay, the port. And then we're going to copy. Now how to get the password. We go to the variables. The variables will contain the root password. You can look at it and copy it, and then go back here and store it in the vault and do that. And now we can test our connection to see that it works. So it did work. We get a warning, but it should work. So now we'll open up the. Why don't we just go ahead and connect to the database. So here we have the database. It's called Railway. And actually there are no tables, and that's okay because we haven't done any database seeding. Okay, the next step is going to be connecting the backend to the database. If you've noticed here, it says that the backend has crashed, and that is because it did not have a handle to the database. We will fix that. Okay, so let's go here, and what we're going to have to do is let's go here, let's open up the backend repository on my machine. So this is a Java Spring Boot application, and it has something called application.properties. And this information gives you the database credentials. So normally, when I was working locally, I could hard code these values in. But now, since I'm working on the cloud, it is preferable not to hard code these values. And in fact, we are going to be adhering to something called the 12-factor principles. If we open this up, the 12-factor app. It's a list of 12 rules to follow to make your SaaS application reliable. So here it says config, store config in the environment. So an app's config is everything that is likely to vary between deploys, and this includes resource handles to the database, memcache, and other backend services, etc. So this is resources handled to the database. So that's why here, when we go back to our application, instead of hard coding the database credentials, we read them as environment variables. And these environment variables are going to be passed in. Railway is going to, if you go back here, it has something called variables, and these are going to be passed in as environment variables to the application container. And so what we need to do is we need to give them the right, we need to give these variables, we need to have these variables be present in the config. So this is kind of easy to do. All we need to do is add new variable. Let's call it, and we'll see if you type, you'll see it appear, I think, automatically. Let me see if that works. Give me a second here. So new variable, add a reference. So here you have all these MySQL things. So we can say MySQL port. So that'll be the MySQL. This is here you see, this is the service, and then that's the variable associated with this service. So if I click add, let's go back to this service here, MySQL, the database. You have a bunch of variables. So it's basically the backend is grabbing the variables from the database and just attaching it to the backend, to the backend service. So let's add all the relevant variables. Let me take a look because I do not remember. MySQL host, MySQL port, so MySQL host, add. We have MySQL port, we have MySQL database. MySQL database. We have MySQL user and we have MySQL password. In the future, we will use configs as code to do all of this, but for now, we're seeing how you could do it in the UI. Checking that those are all the variables we need, and I think that's it. We also have a port variable, but that's just going to default. That's already been set. So now let's redeploy this application and see it work. It's going to take, again, as I said, some time to load up and work. In the meantime, let's take a look at our logs. So again, the build logs show information about building the Docker image. Right now, it hasn't performed anything, but you will shortly see some build logs showing up, and here they are. Found Dockerfile at Dockerfile, uploading the snapshot. Just have to wait a little bit and be patient. So it looked like we get some more stuff in here, and I think that worked. Now we are, let's see here. The deploy logs should happen next. The container should run. And when we see this, we see that it looks like it's working. It didn't crash. So we're on to the next step. Okay, so now we're going to test that the application, that the backend can talk to the database by testing our API calls. So there's this application called Postman, which allows you to programmatically send API requests. It's pretty neat. So here I have a bunch of API requests associated with this project, Federal Transit API. And I have you can add the variable here, an URL, and that URL will get, you don't, instead of having to type in the same URL multiple times for different for different API requests, you can just use this URL. So on the upper right hand, you see here there's an environment. So right now we clicked on, we're using the Federal Transit remote environment. but we need to update the URL in that environment. So we'll go to environments, you can click remote, and then open up the URL. So what is the URL? Let's actually understand what the URL is. So let's go back here to our Federal Transit, and we're going to use the public URL, not the private. Private is only accessible from within Railway. So we're going to copy this and paste it here. Now we also needs to be a URL, so we need to add HTTP. Well, let's see what happens if we add HTTP and see if that works. So we're going to try this, and we're going to go to collections. Let's try this number of agencies API and see what happens. And we get an internal server error. And actually that's correct because because um, because we don't have a database right now set up. So we're going to call this thing, there's different ways of doing it, of seeding the database. You can use database migration and run it. You can use Flyway, and which sort of does it manually. We won't get into the what Flyway does, but Flyway allows you to keep your database in sync. We're using an API request to create the database. So we're going to go to create database, and we're going to send this. This basically creates the schema for the database. Now this didn't work. Now the reason it didn't work is because we used HTTP and not HTTPS. So if you go back to the environments, if you go back to environments and we load this, this is actually HTTP and it should be HTTPS. So let's change that. So we're going to go back and then go back to the create database API. We're going to call it. And now it's loading and it's running. It's going to take a little bit of time to do this. It didn't work. Oh, interesting. Usually it does work. So we have to think about why it didn't work. Maybe there's a problem. Let's go back to environments and try to debug why this is happening. So Federal Transit, oh, we forgot to put a colon here. So that's the reason why. If we go back here, I think that should be the reason. And so if we go back here and we send it, it created the database. So now let's actually see that the database got created. Let's go back to our MySQL Workbench. Let's reload this, and you'll see that we have tables. Tables here, for agency, agency mode, ridership data, and etc. Okay, so now we also need to not seed the database. We've created the database schema, and I also have APIs for that. They're basically called load master and load UPT. So let's go ahead and do that. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's not going to happen immediately. There are different, and now it loaded successfully. Let's go back and check that it got loaded. And you see here the data got loaded. We also have to load UPT. This is part of our application. And it shouldn't take too long to do. Before, on my local machine, this used to take much longer. I think something to do with having it being on Railway makes it a lot quicker. I need to investigate that issue. So it shouldn't take much longer. UPT is a little bit longer than master, and then that should work. So we're now going on to the next step. Okay, so now we're going to test that the application, that the backend can talk to the database by testing our API calls. So there's this application called Postman, which allows you to programmatically send API requests. It's pretty neat. So here I have a bunch of API requests associated with this project, Federal Transit API. And I have you can add the variable here, an URL, and that URL will get, you don't, instead of having to type in the same URL multiple times for different for different API requests, you can just use this URL. So on the upper right hand, you see here there's an environment. So right now we're using the Federal Transit remote environment, but we need to update the URL in that environment. So we'll go to environments, you can click remote, and then open up the URL. So what is the URL? Let's actually understand what the URL is. So let's go back here to our Federal Transit, and we're going to use the public URL, not the private. Private is only accessible from within Railway. So we're going to copy this and paste it here. Now we also needs to be a URL, so we need to add HTTP. Well, let's see what happens if we add HTTP and see if that works. So we're going to try this, and we're going to go to collections, where just try let's try this number of agencies API and see what happens. And we get an internal server error. And actually that's correct because because um, because we don't have a database right now set up. So we're going to call this thing, we're going to actually, there's different ways of doing it, of seeding the database. You can use database migration and run it. You can use Flyway, and which sort of does it manually. We won't get into the what Flyway does, but Flyway allows you to keep your database in sync. We're using an API request to create the database. So we're going to go to create database, and we're going to send this. This basically creates the schema for the database. Now this didn't work. Now the reason it didn't work is because we use HTTP and not HTTPS. So if you go back to the environments, if you go back to environments and we load this, this is actually HTTP and it should be HTTPS. So let's change that. So we're going to go back and then go back to the create database API. We're going to call it. And now it's loading and it's running. It's going to take a little bit of time to do this. It didn't work. Oh, interesting. Usually it does work. So we have to think about why it didn't work. Maybe there's a problem. Let's go back to environments and try to debug why this is happening. So Federal Transit, oh, we forgot to put a colon here. So that's the reason why. If we go back here, I think that should be the reason. And so if we go back here and we send it, it created the database. So now let's actually see that the database got created. Let's go back to our MySQL workbench. Let's reload this, and you'll see that we have tables. Tables here, for agency, agency mode, ridership data, and etc. Okay, so now we also need to not seed the database. We've created the database schema, and I also have APIs for that. They're basically called load master and load UPT. So let's go ahead and do that. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's not going to happen immediately. There are different, and now it loaded successfully. Let's go back and check that it got loaded. And you see here the data got loaded. We also have to load UPT. This is part of our application. And it shouldn't take too long to do. Before, on my local machine, this used to take much longer. I think something to do with having it being on Railway makes it a lot quicker. I need to investigate that issue. So it shouldn't take much longer. UPT is a little bit longer than master, and then that should work. So we're now going on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to try testing the front end to see if the data got correct, if it's correct. Notice that all of these services are online, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're working correctly. Okay, so let's go back to the front end and use the public URL and load it. So we're going to load it, and we're going to have the network tab open while we do this. And notice something here. Now, it might be a little hard to detect. We're going to reload it one more time. We have something and it's failed. So we call this API, and this API didn't work. Now, why didn't it work? Interesting. How do we diagnose this? It doesn't give much information. It just says it didn't work. Where's the First of all, it's not calling the right backend. So we need to fix that. So we need to fix that it's calling the right backend. Right now it's calling localhost 5000. So how do we do that? So if you look at my front end application, it's written in static JavaScript, but I added something called Vite, excuse me. And Vite is a build tool, and it's one of the lightest weight build tools in the JavaScript world. And the reason I do it is the same reason that I have these variables within the backend. So let me open up the front end. So the front end, I have this thing called .m. And this .m contains a variable, byte API URL. It's hard-coded to the local host, and that's why it's using the local host. But we need to override this with the true Vite API, with the true backend API. This corresponds to the backend API URL. So Vite is basically if you look at the package JSON, there's a way to run dev, build, preview. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell the front end to do a build process so that it builds the front end, and then this variable gets populated. Okay, so does that seem clear enough? So we are going to go back to our Railway, and we are going to add a variable called byte API URL. And for now, we're gonna hard code it. We're gonna code it to the to to if you look at variables, these are variables added by Railway. We don't need the public domain. Well, we do need the public domain, so we're going to use this, and we're going to go back. And we're going to, let's just for now, we're just going to copy it. Normally we should use variables, but just for simplicity, we're going to go and add it here. So https this add. And then also what we need to do is we need to go back and we need to go to our build command, and we need to go npm run build. And this is going to basically generate the distribution. Java is going to create minified assets for JavaScript, put them in a dist folder, and while it does that, it's going to create the environment variable for the backend URL, and read from here this API URL. So now it will call the backend. So we need to redeploy, and it's the front end. So the front end doesn't take as long to redeploy. Just be patient and give it a few more seconds. So let's get up our URL. Still loading. It should be done any moment. Taking a little longer than expected, but should be done any moment. Deploying, and now it's online. So let's go ahead and reload the page. Now it's still not going to work, and we'll see, but now at least it's calling the right URL. It's calling this new URL, which is correct. And now we're getting an OK, which is good. But notice that the URL, it's not loading. It's not loading, the map is not loading. And you might wonder why it's not loading. So let's now look, well, that's our next step. Okay, guys. So now we're going to check let's see what's going on and why the map isn't loading. So I'm actually going to read, what I did is I had to actually change this variable to just show you. I get rid of the slash and I redeployed, but it's already redeployed. So let's take a look at the application. So it noticing that it's not loading the data. So what's happening in the network tab? So here we have metro coordinates and it's not found. That's not very helpful, right? It doesn't really tell us much. So so one rule of thumb is if you look in the front end and you have something that doesn't seem very helpful, the next line is to look at the back end. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the back end and see what is going wrong there. So we're going to open up the back end. And so again, we have something called logs, so we can view logs. There's the build logs, which won't be very helpful, and the deploy logs is what we want to look at. We can also look at HTTP logs, which might be helpful, but in our case, we're more interested in what the Spring application is showing. So if we look here, we'll see that we have an error. So this might show something. Here it says unknown column agency.latitude and field list. So what happened? Well, so my application actually had a migration. So the way that the historical context of my application is that first there was no map, and there was no notion of longitude and latitude. The metropolitan areas didn't have latitude and longitude, so latitude and longitude wasn't in the database schema. And then I came over and I added latitude and longitude so that I could plot it in the map. But my database loading script that I ran previously doesn't have latitude and longitude. So what I need to do now is I need to add it in there. And so one way that you can organize these scripts is not up to you how you do it. And if I go to my backend database, let's close backend repository, I have in source, I have some migrations, excuse me, have migrations. So this is the initial schema, which we already ran. And I have a version 2 and version 3. Now this is normally, you would use this for Flyway, but we're not using Flyway because that's a little too complex for our needs. We just need to go ahead and run it. So this is basically the schema change that adds the latitude and longitude to our database. And then this is the data, this is the DDL, the DML, the data that we need to update that gives it the latitude and longitude for the metropolitan area. So we're just going to simply run this in MySQL Workbench. So let's open up MySQL Workbench and let's go ahead and run it. So we need to select a default database. So we're going to say here and set as default schema, and then we're going to run it. So let's go ahead and run it, and we run it, and if we check the table, it should have latitude and longitude, but they haven't been set. So that's the first thing, is the structure change. Now we need to actually update it with the actual data. And I ran a script to get, this is a script that we already have available. So we go here, we paste it, and we're going to try to run it. And we run it, and it looks like it's working mostly. There's a few warnings, but pretty much we don't have to worry about them for this purposes of this demonstration. And we reload the table, and we see that some of them have been filled out. It's fine that not all of them have been filled out. We just need some of them to be filled out for our application to work correctly. So now let's go back and let's test. We actually have we're going to use Postman. First we use Postman, then we'll use the front end. So first we have something that actually tests this API request out to see that it works. So let's test it out. And it doesn't work. Interesting. So that's interesting why it didn't work. Let's diagnose this a little bit longer. There's probably a good reason for why it didn't work. Well, there's nothing there. Okay, so we need to add something. That's a good reason. Let's go ahead and, I don't know why I removed it, but let's go ahead and add the URL back. So it's going to be of the back end, and we're going to go so that we copy the back end, and we're going to, we need to add the protocol, so HTTP and HTTPS, not HTTP. I think we need the slash, so that saves it. And then we go to the collections, we go here to Metro API, and we go send, and here we have it. Here we have the data. So it looks like the backend's working. Now the only thing to do is to test the front end, and we don't have to actually redeploy anything. We just added data. So we can also take a look at, if you want to take a look at the HTTP logs, you'll see that if you scroll this up, the HTTP logs looks like it's hard to see from here, but they work 200. So now we go to the front end. Let's reload the front end and see what happens. And voila, the application is working. You click Seattle, and there you have it. So this shows you how to set up a 3-tier application with a database migration on Railway.